Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, analysts had predicted, and insiders had tracked for weeks. A drone strike that unfolded not over days, not even over hours, but in a matter of minutes. Minutes that changed the security posture of an entire region. Minutes that forced the White House to act. Minutes that sent shockwaves through military command centers from Washington to the Middle East. What Iran did today crossed a line that American leaders had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the U.S. military did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and overwhelming force. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal warnings, just signals that Iran was preparing something unusual. Iran has been unpredictable, yes, but they have been methodical in their unpredictability. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a dance. But what set off alarm bells in the Pentagon this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian military activity know the indicators. The sudden surge in encrypted communications, the movement of drone units from known bases, the uptick in cyber chatter, the sudden blackout of routine radio traffic, all of that went quiet. And whenever Iran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early this morning, U.S. Central Command detected what they described as a coordinated launch sequence, including a swarm of Shad 136 drones that had not been deployed in this region in over a year. These are the kinds of assets that Iran only uses when they are signaling something very specific. Retaliation, escalation, or a test of American resolve. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing its posture. And when a regional power shifts its posture without explanation, even by a small measure, Washington pays attention. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials after an emergency situation room meeting described Iran's move as calculated, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, destabilizing, because it targeted not just a military installation, but the very idea of deterrence in the region. But deterrence only works if the target hesitates. The U.S. military did not. In fact, their response today was among the fastest and most decisive we've seen in recent years. Here's what we know. Within 45 minutes of the drone strike on Al-Tanf base, U.S. forces launched a series of precision airstrikes on Iranian-backed militia positions in eastern Syria. These weren't the usual warning shots. These were targeted strikes using F-15E fighter jets and MQ-9 Reaper drones that the Pentagon only deploys when they are preparing to send a message. We will not tolerate attacks on American personnel. Oh, tonight, Pentagon sources confirmed that U.S. forces launched retaliatory strikes on 3 key targets, including a command and control node that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was a coordinated drone campaign. U.S. forces struck before Iran's proxies could reposition or hide. They hit a weapons storage facility, they hit a drone launch site, they hit a communications hub that was likely preparing to coordinate further attacks. In other words, the U.S. military targeted the backbone of Iran's regional operation. The command and control component that would have made further strikes possible. This is what made the White House's warning so urgent. Iran's drone strike wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could spiral into a wider conflict if left unchecked. And the U.S. military, understanding that fully, responded with force, not reckless. Not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure. They didn't escalate beyond the immediate threat. They hit the right targets. They hit the right networks. And here's where the story becomes even more intense. Intelligence officials now believe that Iran's latest move was designed to test the resolve of the United States after months of perceived American restraint in the region. Iran wanted to see whether Washington would blink, but instead, the opposite happened. The U.S. didn't hesitate. They responded with a show of force that was so rapid, so precise, that even Iranian commanders took notice. You don't get Tehran's attention easily, but today, the U.S. military analysts speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Iran's drone strike as a calculated probe, a way to measure the limits of American patience. But the U.S. proved today that they remain both vigilant and capable. Their actions were not only swift, they were so precise that Iranian-backed militias were unable to mount any immediate counterattack. That precision matters because it shows two things. It shows that the U.S. military is not a passive observer. They are an active deterrent. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of the U.S. response. Air Force pilots carried out coordinated strikes, forcing Iranian-backed fighters to abandon key positions. Special operations teams targeted a logistics hub that had been reinforced in the last 48 hours. Naval assets operating in the eastern Mediterranean reportedly jammed communications used by Iranian operatives to coordinate attacks. This wasn't just a tit-for-tat exchange. This wasn't just a warning shot. This was a demonstration of dominance. This was a message of deterrence, and deterrence is the one thing Iran has struggled to overcome since the U.S. increased its presence in the region. For every advance Iran has made, the U.S. has countered with something that complicates Tehran's plans. Remember, Iran thought the U.S. would avoid direct confrontation. They thought American forces would limit their response to diplomatic protests. They thought the White House would be too distracted by domestic politics to act decisively. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The U.S. is acting with clarity. The U.S. is acting with unity. The U.S. is acting with purpose. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is that Iran's latest move happened at a time when Supreme Leader Khamenei is under unprecedented pressure. Hardliners want escalation. Reformists want negotiation. The Revolutionary Guard wants to project strength. The Iranian public wants relief from sanctions. Khamenei is balancing these demands while facing economic turmoil and growing unrest at home. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The White House's statement, now broadcast across every major network, was designed to signal that the U.S. is not willing to accept attacks on its personnel. Officials said plainly that Iran's drone strike was inconsistent with international norms and the rules of engagement. That is diplomatic language for, "We will not let this stand." You don't usually hear that tone from the White House unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, President Biden addressed the nation in a measured, resolute speech tonight. He said, "The United States will defend its people and its interests wherever they are threatened." He said, "We do not seek conflict, but we will not hesitate to act when our forces are attacked." And he said, "Let this serve as a warning to those who would test our resolve." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a commander-in-chief who understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the drone strike, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq also launched rockets at coalition bases. Houthi rebels in Yemen increased drone activity targeting shipping lanes. Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon ramped up surveillance of Israeli positions. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing a broader campaign of asymmetric attacks. Another is that Iran is attempting to force the U.S. into a reactive posture, hoping to exploit any overreach. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to provoke a regional crisis to distract from domestic instability. But today, the U.S. military took that card off the table. They didn't wait for more attacks. They didn't issue empty threats. They didn't limit themselves to diplomatic protests. They responded with force. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see if the U.S. will back down. The U.S. wants to show that it will not. The Pentagon wants to prevent a wider war. And the State Department wants to prevent a diplomatic collapse. Tonight, we've heard from military sources who are now monitoring Iranian movements across the region. They say Iranian-backed militias are dispersing, going underground. They say Iran's Revolutionary Guard is increasing security at key installations. And they say Iran's decision to launch a drone strike is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test U.S. red lines. But the U.S. military is not standing down. In fact, they are increasing their alert posture. Their response today, rapid, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Iran that attacks on U.S. forces will not go unanswered. And it sent a message to America's allies that the U.S. remains committed to regional security. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Iran hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that the White House's response was timely. It restored deterrence, it reassured allies, and it reminded adversaries that the U.S. will defend its interests. What happens next will depend on what Iran does in the coming days. If they escalate, this moment will be remembered as the spark that ignited a wider conflict. If they back down, the U.S. has already shown it is ready to respond. They have shown they are ready to act. And tonight, for the first time in months, Iran appears to be recalculating. Tehran is quiet, too quiet, and when Iran is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Iran learned something they have learned many times before. The U.S. will not be intimidated. The U.S. will not be provoked without consequence. And the U.S. will always defend its people. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear. Deterrence has been restored. Allies have been reassured, and adversaries have been warned, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.